Western powers drain Africa's wealth while its people suffer in poverty. Africa, a continent blessed with vast natural resources, is paradoxically home to some of the world's poorest populations. From diamonds and gold to oil and rare earth minerals, Africa's riches should, in theory, create wealth for its people. Instead, these resources have become a curse, with Western powers, alongside multinational corporations, extracting immense wealth while leaving the continent underdeveloped and in poverty. The ongoing exploitation continues to cement this unequal relationship, causing severe socio-economic consequences for African nations and creating bleak prospects for the continent's future if the status quo persists. Historical context of exploitation. The exploitation of Africa's resources by Western powers is deeply rooted in the colonial era. European nations carved up Africa during the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, imposing arbitrary borders and establishing systems of economic control designed to serve European interests. Africans were systematically disenfranchised and forced into labor, with their lands used to extract resources for European markets. Even after independence, African countries remained entangled in an economic system that favored the West. Colonial infrastructures were designed to funnel resources out of Africa, and little has changed in modern times. Post-colonial Africa saw the rise of neo-colonialism, where Western nations and corporations continued to exert economic dominance through financial systems, trade agreements, and debt traps. Multinational corporations stepped in, taking control of the continent's most valuable resources, continuing to enrich Western nations and their elites at the expense of African development. Many African countries, saddled with foreign debt and reliant on foreign aid, have been unable to break free from this cycle. Contemporary examples of resource exploitation. Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC. The DRC is perhaps the most glaring example of how Africa's wealth is siphoned off by foreign interests. Rich in cobalt, coltan, and diamonds, the DRC should be one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Instead, it remains one of the poorest. Cobalt, crucial for the global technology industry, is a prime target for Western and Chinese companies alike. Nearly two-thirds of the world's cobalt comes from the DRC, yet its people see little benefit. Many miners work in dangerous, informal conditions, earning meager wages. Global demand for electronics has fueled this exploitation, with large multinational companies profiting while turning a blind eye to labor abuses and corruption. Nigeria. Nigeria, Africa's largest oil producer, has long been an economic powerhouse in terms of crude oil exports. Yet, the country faces severe economic inequality, with millions of Nigerians living in poverty. Much of the country's oil wealth is controlled by foreign companies like Shell and Chevron. The oil-rich Niger Delta, where most of the country's oil is extracted, has suffered massive environmental damage due to oil spills and gas flaring, devastating local communities. Corruption and mismanagement of oil revenues by the government, often facilitated by Western corporate interests, have left Nigeria heavily dependent on oil exports with little diversification in its economy. South Africa and the mining sector. South Africa is home to some of the world's largest deposits of gold and platinum, but its mining sector is dominated by Western corporations. While the country remains the largest producer of platinum globally, the benefits of this wealth are unequally distributed. Mining communities often experience poor living conditions, labor strikes, and violent crackdowns, all while mining profits flow out of the country. The Marikana massacre in 2012, where striking miners were killed while demanding better wages, highlights the brutal lengths to which corporations and governments will go to protect their interests. Western influence through financial institutions. Beyond direct resource extraction, Western countries maintain control over Africa through international financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. These institutions have imposed neoliberal economic policies on African countries, including the privatization of public assets, austerity measures, and trade liberalization. Under the guise of development assistance, these policies often benefit Western corporations and investors at the expense of African economic sovereignty. For example, during the 1980s and 1990s, structural adjustment programs, peace, imposed by the IMF and World Bank devastated African economies. Countries were forced to cut public spending on education, healthcare, and infrastructure, leaving them vulnerable to external shocks. These programs resulted in deepened poverty, greater inequality, and weakened states. While the debts accumulated under these programs persist, African countries continue to be economically dependent on foreign loans, locking them into a cycle of debt and underdevelopment. Impact on African societies and economies. The consequences of this exploitation are stark. Africa is home to 60% of the world's arable land, yet it remains one of the most food-insecure regions. Resource wealth has not translated into better living conditions, as most of the profits flow out of the continent, leaving behind environmental destruction, underdeveloped infrastructure, and political instability. Countries like Angola and Equatorial Guinea have immense oil wealth, yet their populations suffer from extreme poverty and inequality. Across Africa, millions lack access to basic healthcare, education, and clean water. Corruption, often supported by foreign interests, continues to plague many African nations. Western corporations are frequently complicit in bribing government officials, ensuring that they can secure lucrative contracts with little accountability. This fuels internal conflicts, as rival factions vie for control of resource-rich regions, perpetuating cycles of violence and displacement. The future of Africa's wealth and its people. Looking ahead, the future of Africa's wealth is uncertain. As the global economy shifts toward renewable energy and technological advancements, Africa's resources will continue to be in high demand, particularly in sectors like cobalt and lithium for electric vehicles and renewable energy storage. However, if the current model of exploitation continues, Africa's people will remain excluded from the benefits of this new global economy. There are signs of hope, however. Movements for greater economic independence and resource nationalization are growing across the continent. Countries like Tanzania and Zambia have begun to renegotiate mining contracts, demanding a larger share of the profits. In addition, regional organizations such as the African Union are pushing for more intra-African trade through initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, which aims to reduce dependency on Western markets. Moreover, a rising generation of African leaders, activists, and economists are calling for greater transparency, investment in human capital, and a shift away from the extractive model that has dominated Africa's economies for centuries. If Africa can leverage its natural resources to develop industries, create jobs, and invest in education and infrastructure, the continent has the potential to become a major economic player in the global economy. However, the road to economic liberation is fraught with challenges. The global financial system is heavily weighted in favor of Western powers, and entrenched corporate interests will resist efforts to disrupt the status quo. Unless African nations can unite and assert control over their resources, the future could see continued exploitation, with Africa remaining rich in resources but poor in opportunity. Strategies for African nations to overcome exploitation. To break the cycle of exploitation, African nations must pursue bold, unified strategies that prioritize long-term development over short-term gains from resource extraction. These strategies require both internal reforms and external alliances, as the forces of economic neocolonialism are entrenched and well-organized. Below are key strategies that could help African nations regain control over their resources and foster sustainable development. 1. Resource nationalization and fair contracts. One of the most direct ways for African nations to reclaim their wealth is through resource nationalization or the renegotiation of existing contracts with multinational corporations. Countries like Tanzania and Zambia have already made moves in this direction. For example, in Tanzania, under former President John Magufuli, the government imposed stricter regulations on mining companies, demanding that they pay a larger share of taxes and royalties. Zambia, a major copper producer, has also renegotiated contracts with foreign mining firms to secure more favorable terms for the country. By controlling a larger share of the profits from their resources, African governments can reinvest this wealth into infrastructure, education, and healthcare, which are crucial for long-term development. However, nationalization or renegotiation efforts require strong governance and anti-corruption measures to ensure that new revenue streams benefit the population rather than lining the pockets of corrupt officials. 2. Strengthening regional cooperation. Africa is often exploited due to the fragmentation of its economies. Many countries are small, isolated markets that have little bargaining power individually. By increasing regional cooperation and trade, African nations can strengthen their collective bargaining power and reduce their reliance on Western markets. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, is a significant step in this direction. Launched in 2021, AFCFTA aims to create a single market for goods and services across the continent, allowing African countries to trade with each other more easily. This could reduce the need to export raw materials to Western countries at low prices and instead encourage the development of value-added industries within Africa. If fully implemented, AFCFTA could transform Africa into a more self-sufficient, integrated economic bloc, reducing its vulnerability to exploitation by external powers. 3. Diversification of economies. Many African countries are overly reliant on a single resource or sector, making them vulnerable to price fluctuations and exploitation. For example, oil-dependent nations like Nigeria and Angola suffer when global oil prices drop, leaving them with few alternatives to stabilize their economies. Diversification is critical for breaking this dependency. Investing in sectors such as agriculture, manufacturing, and renewable energy could help create jobs, reduce poverty, and ensure more stable economic growth. Rwanda, for instance, has successfully diversified its economy by investing in technology and services, becoming a regional hub for IT and business process outsourcing. Similarly, Ethiopia has made strides in expanding its manufacturing sector, particularly in textiles and apparel, creating thousands of jobs in the process. 4. Human capital development. One of the most underutilized resources in Africa is its human capital. The continent has a young and growing population, which could become a major driver of economic growth if properly educated and empowered. However, many African countries suffer from inadequate education systems, lack of vocational training, and limited access to healthcare. Investing in human capital through education and health reforms is essential for building a competitive, innovative workforce that can participate in global industries beyond resource extraction. African governments should prioritize STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, education to equip the next generation with the skills needed to lead the continent's development. In addition, healthcare investments are crucial to ensure a healthy, productive workforce capable of driving economic growth. 5. Fighting corruption and promoting good governance. Corruption remains one of the biggest obstacles to economic justice in Africa. Foreign corporations often exploit weak governance by bribing officials to secure lucrative contracts, ensuring that profits are funneled out of the country. Fighting corruption requires strengthening institutions, promoting transparency, and ensuring that leaders are accountable to their citizens. Initiatives such as open contracting, where governments publish all contracts with foreign corporations for public scrutiny, can help reduce corruption. Countries like Botswana and Mauritius have made significant progress in promoting good governance and fighting corruption, achieving relatively high levels of economic growth and development as a result. African nations must also work together to promote democratic governance across the continent. Strong, democratic institutions are more likely to protect national interests and resist exploitation by foreign powers. The role of international solidarity. While African nations must take the lead in reclaiming their wealth, international solidarity can play a crucial role in supporting these efforts. Global movements for economic justice, human rights, and environmental sustainability can help raise awareness of the exploitation Africa faces and pressure multinational corporations and Western governments to change their policies. 1. Reforming global financial systems. One of the major tools of Western exploitation is the global financial system, including institutions like the IMF and World Bank. These organizations often impose harmful neoliberal policies on African countries, such as austerity measures and privatization of public assets. Global campaigns calling for the cancellation of odious debts, debts incurred through corrupt or illegitimate regimes, could provide much-needed relief for African nations trapped in debt cycles. Furthermore, reforming tax havens and cracking down on illicit financial flows would prevent multinational corporations from evading taxes in Africa. Global movements advocating for corporate tax transparency and accountability can help African countries retain more of their wealth. 2. Ethical consumerism and corporate accountability. International solidarity can also be fostered through ethical consumerism. As awareness of labor abuses, environmental destruction, and resource exploitation grows, consumers in the West can pressure corporations to adopt more ethical practices. Campaigns demanding that companies source their materials responsibly, pay fair wages, and respect environmental regulations can help reduce exploitation in African supply chains. Organizations such as Fairtrade International and the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, EITI, already work to promote transparency and ethical practices in resource extraction. Expanding these efforts and ensuring that they have real enforcement mechanisms could help shift the balance of power in Africa's favor. 3. Global support for African-led movements. Finally, international solidarity should prioritize African-led movements and initiatives. Too often, global campaigns for economic justice are driven by outsiders with little understanding of the local context. African activists, civil society organizations, and grassroots movements are already working to combat exploitation and promote sustainable development across the continent. Global allies can support these efforts by amplifying African voices, providing funding and resources for grassroots movements, and pushing for policies that align with African interests rather than Western agendas. The success of movements like #EndSARS in Nigeria, which fought against police brutality and corruption, shows the power of African youth and civil society in demanding change. Global support for such movements can help accelerate Africa's push for economic liberation. Conclusion. Africa stands at a crossroads. The continent's immense wealth has long been a source of exploitation, but there is growing momentum for change. Through strategies such as resource nationalization, regional cooperation, diversification, human capital investment, and anti-corruption efforts, African nations can begin to reclaim their resources and build a more prosperous future for their people. However, this path is fraught with challenges, and the international community must stand in solidarity with Africa's push for economic justice. The road ahead is long, but if African nations can unite and resist exploitation, they have the potential to transform their economies, lifting millions out of poverty and building a brighter future for the continent. The question remains, will Africa seize this moment to reclaim its destiny, or will the forces of exploitation continue to dominate its wealth?